you an executive working to build a resilient culture that empowers the people of your organization to thrive in business and life? This podcast is for you. 7-7 Impact uses our 7-pillar framework focused on humanizing leadership to fight against a 30-year battle of unengaged employees so that organizations can create a culture of engagement, increased revenues, and consistent opportunities. Forbes identifies organizations who put priority and trust can yield a 16% increase in profit margin, 19% greater operating margin, 18% increased productivity, and 2.6x increase in earning per share. So trust leads to increased performance. Do your people trust you? Trust your leadership? Trust your organization? Today will be an amazing episode on C-Suite 7, discussing 7-7 Impact's fourth pillar, trust. So Lindsay, wow, trust, right? If we start unpacking trust and what it means, as we've previously talked about, it's a feeling and it takes time to build up that trust. So how do we do this with organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, I think that because trust is so much about a perception that somebody might have or a feeling that is going to be different for everybody. I believe that it starts with a little bit of awareness as a leader, having that awareness of what people need, how you are showing up for them or presenting yourself to them, trying to be consistent so that and opening a safe space for people to be able to bring their full selves forward and not be scared to share, be innovative, or ask questions.
Yeah, so saying that there's a level of awareness, and I think that kind of creeps throughout the entire organization and the people all through the organizational structure or org chart, because certainly senior executives should have a different level of awareness, not only with their direct interactions, but they are ultimately responsible for that trust throughout the entire organization. We've all heard trust the process or just trust me, and those are pretty shallow words when we're talking about such an intimate word and process and what that really means, especially if we tie that back into those Forbes data points and some other data points we've talked about. Clearly, there's a massive impact on the bottom line, and trust needs to be learned. And if it's not earned properly and consistently, there's going to be problems, right? If we kind of break down maybe one of those data points, and if we understand on, well, maybe just the question is how could a feeling or trust being a feeling impact profit margin?
Man, I think that trust in your employer, trust in your direct manager, trust within your corporation, your teammates, it definitely has a direct relation to what I am going to do as a work-wise. At one point, I had a team of 3, and I've worked on teams almost my entire life. But this team of 3, we never knew where one of our partners was. We were just like, I wonder if what they're doing, like, where are they at? Because you never heard of any of our accounts, like, talking about them or saying, oh, they were just here. You don't know where the routing was. You don't know if they're doing what they said that they were going to do. And then moving forward, I had another team of 3. There was like a call every single morning. We knew exactly where we were going to be. We knew exactly what we were going to do. I had full trust that they were going to do their part. I was doing my part. And we got 6 years in a row of President's Club because we didn't have to micromanage each other or know every step that was being done, but we trusted each other enough to know that we were each doing our part and we would come together. And it's that engagement, the level of engagement, the level of how much you want to work, how much you want to do what you're there to do, and at what level you want to do it. It changes with the amount of trust that you have in somebody. If somebody wakes up and they're like, well, what's the point? Like, they're not doing their part. Why should I go and do all of my part? Well, that trust is down, and so is the profit.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from that is it's not that trust is directly tied to the level of presence, as in your first example there, but in the second example, there was trust because of the bond and the cohesive approach to your team for business application. There's a term that one of my boss used to say. It was, you say trust but verify. And I always thought it was rather condescending. I'm like, that's just a way of saying just do what I say, or I'm going to trust what you're doing, but not really believe it or know. it,
But I'm going to check
it,
over it.
right. Yeah. So I think it's a hilarious statement. And I believe when we have that real bond and trust within our team relationships, greatness will happen, things will happen, all those data points. You'll see it. Like you said, you had President's Club for a number of years in a row. But as a company, if the company is operating in trust, it yields into something like the 2.6x in shares, because not only do the people of the company believe in the trust and feel the trust and know that there's trust, the shareholders know it too. And that radiates out from a level of productivity and really a company doing what they say they're going to do all the way across the board.
I totally agree. And, I gave an example about an experience that I had with a partner. And that was just one partner or, one experience that I had. But how do you think that my trust was towards my manager? That he was managing me and another person the same. And here I was doing all the work and this other person wasn't, and he was tolerating it. And so therefore it took that trust factor away from him as well. And it does trickle through the company when people, whether you don't trust your coworker or you don't trust your direct manager, ultimately one does affect the other at the end of the day. And if it's leading through the company where not everybody trusts each other or there's inconsistencies, then it certainly does show up on the bottom line.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to go back to the point that trust is inherently a feeling. And we don't like to talk about feelings, especially in the workplace. But however, that's not addressed, it's dismissed. And so, how do we do that effectively? And Lindsay, I'm thinking we can say the word trust, and our listeners are going to know what trust is. But let's break it down to a little bit deeper level. Like, really, what is trust? And when I hear the word, I really believe in another word called rest, and that we don't have to be anxious about what maybe my manager is going to do, or what my people underneath me are going to do, or the people laterally, or even customers. We can rest in that trust so we can be more effective at our job. Back to those data points, we will yield those increases.
Yeah, I love that. And another word I think of is just almost awareness. I think of just the vulnerability. I think of having a safe space. When I think of trust, I think of somebody that can recognize me for who I am and that I can show up as my full self without worry, without being worried about it, kind of like you said, with rest. If I can't do that, then there's an automatic red flag of a lack of trust. There's got to be a reason why I can't show up as my full self. Why is that? What is it about it? And it gets pretty tricky, especially for those of us who don't love to talk about feelings. But from somebody that comes from positive psychology, I'm all over the feelings spectrum. And I know that if something's off, we got to figure out what it is, or else it actually creates something bigger. One of the ways that I feel like people can create trust in something, like in a culture, an executive, a manager can create a trusting environment, is just respecting everybody, treating everybody the same, no matter what level they are, where they are, or where they come from, but just being consistent in the way that they treat people. Also, the amount of toleration that they have for disrespect and behavioral issues, right? So if they're tolerating people treating them poorly, or people not showing up, then I feel like there's an immediate lack of trust that can happen within an organization or a team. And then just being transparent and being honest. Facts are always going to be facts. No need to sugarcoat it or amplify it or exaggerate it. Just lay it out there. Sometimes, especially I know in a sales environment, it's easy to amplify something to make it sound great, and that doesn't always create trust, because then people start to think that maybe you're going to do something or you're not going to do something that you're insinuating that you are. So to me, those are a few things that you can do to create trust in your environment. What about you?
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that you put it out there, because the way to wrap some of that up is trust takes time. And often we talk about Band-Aid approaches, how they don't work, how companies are spending billions of dollars on these Band-Aid approaches and can't do that with trust at all. Trust takes time. It will evolve. It takes a series of actions. And a gentleman that we've come across, his name's David Horsiger, has built his entire career and company on that word trust and what that means to corporations. And so I really appreciate how he breaks down. He has 8 pillars that support that word trust. And I'll go through them real quick here. Clarity, compassion, character, competency, commitment, connection, contribution, and consistency. Now, there's a lot of crossover with what Lindsay was just saying. And so we don't think that there needs to be this huge, massive and recreation of making the wheel. Trust is important. And one of the things David carries in his conversations is that trust is the big why. And I hear that, I'm like, holy cow, that's a lot to say there. And he's, again, dedicated his career on research of looking at that word trust, why it's important, but also hitting on what Lindsay was just talking about. How do you create trust within an environment, within a work environment? There's so many moving parts, and people are all different. And when we look at different sectors, I mean, we have the good old boy club type businesses, and then we have other businesses that are operating completely opposite. So there's a huge spectrum, but it comes down to the engagement with people, and it absolutely comes down from the leadership team. Because the thing is the leaders will always dictate and determine the environment. I'll say that again. Leaders will dictate the environment, and trust is an environmental attribute to the culture. And so leaders out there, we have to focus on back to some of the basics of why we're in business, what we're going to do, but how do we engage those people? Again, how Lindsay mentioned, when there's less trust or no trust, we see less engagement. And this is all about engaging the people we have to carry out why we're in business.
I love that. Thank you for sharing those 8 pillars that he incorporates with trust, because without even thinking about it, I mean, I even said a lot of those things and they directly tied to what he said. And as you were talking, I couldn't help but remember that moment that I know that I've shared on this podcast before, but when I was new to a company and I was at this national sales meeting and the executive came down and was like shaking all of our hands. He was there for all of 20 minutes, but he was walking around. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for being here, shaking our hands, and took some pictures with us. He didn't have to do that, but the impact that he did when he did do that, I mean, I was all in. I felt like he actually cared. He treated me with enough respect to like actually come down, and I was lowest guy on the totem pole at that point, right? And he still treated me as if he was so happy that I was there. And from that point forward, I would do anything. I trusted every direction that he had. He was very present. And when he was present in the organization, and he did make a point to go around to everybody. I had no reason not to trust him.
I love that story. It makes me think about, as a new employee into a culture, we can start off with this basic level of trust, but it's never really that deep rooted trust. And what happens is over time, either we start becoming part of that culture and that trust, or we don't. And so how did that person evolve over your relationship with that organization? What did that look like? So you started the company, you met specifically with the CEO in this event. You stated, wow, I have ultimate trust. I will do anything for these people. What did that look like as time went on with your experience in that organization?
Honestly, I did anything and everything. What I loved about that company is that every program was placed around a core value or our mission or vision. They were very clear on what that looked like for us and why we're doing it and how it surrounds who we are. We had to practice what we preach. So we had certain workshops for employees that mirrored the workshops that we would give to our clients. So they wanted us to be embodied in what we preached. So we were practicing it every day. And that did wonders for our business. But I also found myself like always trying to be innovative, finding a way to make it happen, finding a way to make things work, finding a way to make something better. And I was open about sharing it. My maiden name was Bell, and there was something that they called the Bell Reports, where it ended up going nationwide. I would train nationwide on these little reports that I created because they had impact on my business, but they honored me for that. And to me, it was like, I would just do whatever I could to make things work, and I'd be open to sharing. And as a result, everybody benefited from it, including me, because I got to hear other people's perspective or what's working for them. And we got to add on to what I had already created to make something masterful. It was just a really great collaboration. And for a long time, that company had very little turnover. Nobody would leave. Ultimately, that CEO did retire and things shifted a little bit. But while he was there, the culture was like something I'd never experienced before.
Wow, what a great experience. I'm hearing exactly what we're talking about. Not only did that CEO have that level of awareness of how much influence he could have on business, but also people. And that takes me back to some of the Gallup reports, and the level of recognition leads to that trust. And that is more important to people than pay. And that directly ties to a level of attrition or turnover. Executives, we have an opportunity to fully impact, and we even heard it in the 8 pillars of trust. It was number 6 is connection with the people. That is so important. And Lindsay, you stated that when that CEO left, things had changed. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I have a master's in organizational change management. I was watching it from afar. I knew that there was going to be change, although there was hope that there wouldn't be. When the new CEO came in, it was a clear difference in how he represented himself. There was a clear difference in the way that he connected with the people of the company. He certainly wasn't down in the mix of things trying to introduce himself or be a part of it. He actually had escorts to take him off stage so nobody would bother him. And you could just tell that his intentions didn't align up with what we had been practicing for so long. So some of the first things that I noticed that didn't always seem bad. Good change management, change organization isn't going to yank everything out from underneath you at once. They're going to do slow change. And that's kind of what he did. But the programs where we practiced what we preached, those employee programs that helped us be our best self, that helped us grow individually, were taken away. Those were no longer there. So it kind of became this thing where it was like you no longer heard the mission or the vision or the core values spoken about with initiatives. It was usually about bottom line and what they wanted to do, projections. But it was like the heart of our company was kind of stripped away with the communication. And so it seemed like for me personally, the passion that I had tied so much to time and effort and energy to in my job was now mainly loyal to my clients because I built such a rapport to them, but I didn't feel that loyalty so much on the side with my company anymore. I just felt like I was a fraud in a way.
Super interesting. Wow. We could probably talk about this for hours. I love how that experience you have ties into so much with what we're doing and why we're doing that. I'm hearing that you had this organization that had a strong heartbeat in engagement, as we see is a massive struggle globally. Very few companies are doing it well, and some companies are attempting to do it. There's a lot of approaches that just aren't working because of, like you said, maybe the intent or the why behind that. But you experienced an organization doing it well, and then there was a transition. And I want to know more about how in this transition, not only you changed through that management. And I love that you said loyalty to customers, because I've had a very similar experience where things change, but then we have a loyalty and a sense of integrity to why we're doing it, and we're going to do it the best we can. But then we become almost lone wolf and isolated in that, and you can still be a top performer, but the whole story changes quite a bit. And so my point is, when that change happened, and I'm sure you're not the only person that had that shift of loyalty, but with this new CEO in place and having a bottom line focus, how did that change those analytics or those data points for your company? If they're even comparable from your first CEO that instilled all these positive things, transition to new CEO that was purely focused on numbers, bottom line, whatever the case. What did that look like for your revenues, for the margins, for your shareholders?
From what I remember, it didn't actually affect the shareholders, the stocks, or the profits right away. But what did happen is half of that division ended up leaving. And then they had to bring on new people. There was a lot of open territories. Competition swooped in. And then there was a bigger issue, right? There was a much bigger issue. There was a point where I remember my quota from one quarter to the next was almost tripled. It was almost impossible. But it also, I noticed there was a lot of coworkers that were trying to do everything they could to make their quotas so they could make their money, even if it wasn't necessarily ethical or within company guidelines, which made it harder for a lot of other people that were following company guidelines because they were actually making their quotas, but they were doing it maybe a little unethically. And so it made it look like those that were staying ethical weren't performing. So that made us look even worse. And then things didn't change. Usually when nobody's able to make something happen, then they're like, okay, we need to rework these numbers. But because there was a portion that went over and beyond and did, even no matter the cost, it didn't really help the people that were ethical. So it just seemed like there was a lot of dishonesty going on. There was just like, you never knew what you were going to get. You felt like your integrity was being questioned. And to me, I had built such a beautiful business, such a sustainable business. And I did have so much loyalty to my customers. I wasn't willing to bend who I was on the other side of things. And it became very exhausting. And I was working a lot more than I had ever worked, 60, 70 hours a week, just to make sure that I could get in what I needed to get in. And I ended up leaving.
I certainly hear you painting that picture of an engaged organization and maybe even a statement of people matter. And when people matter, they're engaged and they do the right thing, and that leads to the sales, that leads to business objectives and goals. And then with that shift of chaos, free for all, did the business do better? Was the bottom line better? Was there more revenues in this new environment?
Ultimately, I think that it was, and I would have to go back and kind of look at those numbers, but I remember it did have the ebb and flow of going up and down. There was panic, which is why we had so many initiatives going on, because our stocks did drop, which is why we had so many initiatives, because then we felt like we were doing it just for the stock, for the prices, and not necessarily for our customers. And I do remember, I'm going to correct myself, I mean, like one of the reasons why it was just like time for me to go at that point is I did feel like I had a bigger purpose. I had learned so much from working in such an environment, and then seeing the transition of what it was going into, and somebody that had a master's of change management and leadership organizational skills wanted to do something more. But when the straw that kind of broke was the manager that I had, the direct manager that I had, he was getting promoted. And I had so much trust in him. I felt like he always had my back. I felt like he was always there to support us with whatever we needed. I felt like I could come to him with anything that I had, and whether he agreed with it or disagreed with it, he still listened, and we had a conversation about it. When he was no longer going to be my manager, I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. It was definitely time. So it did have a lot to do with the fact that I think I would have been able to hang on a little bit longer if my direct manager wasn't going. But because he was, I just felt like I didn't want to put myself or my family through that change.
Wow. Yeah. So even when you say put your family through, that is where we're truly thinking about the people of our companies. It affects all areas of life, whether it's amount of time and energy invested into the company for the cause, but even going back to why do we do this and why is it important? I can really see how David's 8 pillars come to life in your story, and even some of the things we talk about, because they're all components of living in that environment where we can have trusted relationships, but it's top down and bottom up. It's both approaches. Truly be operating in that trust, and not to continually repeat myself, but it takes time to earn the trust, and it does take the consistency, and the proof is in the pudding, right? We really get involved with how do these attributes, trust is our 4th pillar in the 7-7 impacts framework. How does that really affect the company on a wide scale perspective? And one of the things is when we're using the other pillars, trust comes very easy. When we're not focused on these other pillars in our framework, trust is very challenging. The last thing we need as running companies is more tasks, more things to do. But what we see time and time over again, when we're operating in these pillars, some of them come very simple, and it's not more work. It actually frees up an entire amount of time, and the benefits you can't reproduce. Just like in Lindsay's story, when she said people were sticking around, they had very low turnover. There was a shift in leadership, and then it went roller coaster and a lot of unknown variables. And one of the things we struggle with in today's marketplace is people leaving, hiring good hires, and retraining and keeping up with business in challenging times. Folks, just think, what would it look like if you had a committed people base where there was real trust, where you just knew people had your back, but they still gave you the space to be creative, to operate within not only policies and procedures, but the full cultural aspect.
That was beautifully said, Scott, because there's nothing I can really add to that, except for the fact that, too, is that when you're building a company or you have a company, every layer of that company is doing something for the benefit, or else that a position wouldn't exist, right? So I think that when leadership and executives and management all can be consistent in the way that they treat everybody, no matter on what level they're at, I do feel like that brings the in of the culture too. The cohesiveness and the trust within the corporation. They all feel part of something. And I think that does something for everybody involved.
Yeah, awesome. Wrapping up here to focus on, again, trust is a feeling. We should address it. It takes time. We have the right to earn it, and everybody has that right. Trust will always be there, whether there is trust or no trust. Trust can be viewed as a statement of rest and comfort, of not that uphill battle of knowing where your efforts are expended, if it makes sense, or you just don't know. So we can eliminate those unknown variables within business. But leaders, that is always set from your perspective. Leaders always have the right to dictate and determine what that culture environment looks like. And when the trust is there, there's plenty of data supporting that it will yield to greater profits, greater margins that will bleed over to shareholders and everything. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today on C-Suite 7 podcast. We really are enjoying to have these conversations on how you can help facilitate a different and potentially better culture and empower your people to be their best and to show up their best for your company.